The first load arrived on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. Ellie Carter heard the truck before she saw it. Its engine coughed down the dirt road, rattling loose boards along the side of the old barn. She stepped outside carrying a dented feed bucket and watched Farmer Briggs reverse toward the fence behind the building. 3 men sat in the truck bed beside a pile of rusted metal, broken chains, bent hinges, a wagon rim split nearly in half, 2 horseshoes orange with rust, and the remains of an old plow blade so worn that one edge looked thinner than a kitchen knife. Briggs leaned through the window. "Morning, Ellie." She said nothing. His grin widened. "Brought you some more treasure." The men laughed. Ellie lowered her eyes to the feed bucket. She had heard that word before. Treasure. They always said it like that now. At first, the farmers had simply noticed that she kept old metal. Then they discovered how easily the quiet 12-year-old could become entertainment. If a piece was too rusty to sell, too awkward to store, and too heavy to bother hauling into town, someone eventually brought it to the Carter farm. Briggs raised the truck bed. The iron came crashing down. The noise struck the ground like 100 broken bells and echoed across the empty fields. Ellie's grandfather appeared in the barn doorway. "Briggs," he called, "we're not running a junkyard." Briggs shrugged. "Could have fooled me." Another burst of laughter. Ellie felt her grandfather glance toward her. That hurt more than Briggs. Not because her grandfather was ashamed of her. Because she knew he was tired of watching grown men make his granddaughter the joke of the valley. The truck finally pulled away through a cloud of dust. "One day," her grandfather muttered. "I'm making you clear all that out." Ellie nodded without arguing. Then she walked toward the newest pile. Most of the metal looked exactly the way the farmers described it. Dead, flaking, pitted, bent beyond recognition. She lifted one piece, dropped it, tried another. Then her hand stopped. Half buried beneath the broken wagon rim was a thick strip of dark steel. Rust covered most of its surface, but one fractured edge looked different. Solid, dense. Ellie dragged it free and carried it toward a flat stone beside the barn wall. She struck it once. Ting! The note rang clear. Her grandfather turned. Ellie struck it again. Ting! Something inside her tightened. Not happiness exactly. Memory. For one instant, she could almost smell oil on her father's workbench again. Almost hear the hammer he used to hold. Almost hear his voice telling her that rust showed what had happened to iron. It didn't always tell you what was left inside. Ellie looked toward the road where Briggs's truck had disappeared. Then she carried the strip into the barn. Months later, those same men would return, but they wouldn't be laughing, and they wouldn't be bringing Ellie their garbage. They would be asking whether she had enough of it left to save their farms. There was a reason Ellie never threw old metal away. It had started long before Farmer Briggs made her the joke of the valley. When Ellie was 7, the barn had sounded different. Back then, there was almost always hammering inside. Her father, Thomas Carter, kept a small workbench against the eastern wall beneath a window so dusty that afternoon sunlight entered in narrow golden beams. He wasn't a blacksmith. He wasn't an engineer. He was simply a farmer who couldn't afford to replace everything that broke. And on a farm, something was always breaking. A gate hinge, a chain, a cultivator bracket, a wagon latch. Thomas kept coffee cans filled with bolts, washers, rivets, and pieces of metal that looked useless to everyone except him. Ellie used to sit on an overturned bucket and watch. One afternoon, she saw him pick up a rusted piece of iron from beneath the bench. "That one's dead," she said. Thomas smiled. "Is it?" He handed it to her. The surface was rough and orange. Rust came off against her fingers. "Looks dead." Her father took a hammer and tapped different parts of the piece. Then he pointed toward an area where corrosion had eaten deeply into the metal. "This part, maybe." He moved his finger several inches farther down. "But this?" He scraped the surface with a file. Underneath the brown scale appeared a dark line of solid metal. Ellie leaned closer. Thomas smiled. "Never judge the whole piece by its worst spot." Over the following years, Ellie watched him work that way again and again. A broken object didn't automatically become garbage. First, Thomas examined it. Some pieces were too cracked. Some were too thin. Some were so badly corroded that he tossed them into a separate pile and never trusted them again. But sometimes a useless object still contained a useful piece. He might cut 6 inches from an old bracket, save 2 bolts from a broken implement, turn part of a wagon strap into a simple gate repair. Nothing miraculous, just practical. Then, one winter, the hammering stopped. Thomas died after a short illness. The workbench remained exactly where he had left it. His hammer gathered dust, the vise stiffened, and Ellie stopped entering that corner of the barn for almost 2 years, until the Carter farm began running out of money. One evening, her grandfather placed 3 bills on the kitchen table: feed, seed, and a replacement hinge for the barn door. They could afford 2. Ellie stared at the numbers. Then she looked through the kitchen window toward the barn. She remembered the coffee cans, the old vise, and something her father had once told her. "Don't ask what the thing used to be, Ellie." She could almost hear his voice. "Ask what the good part can still do." That night, Ellie entered her father's workshop for the first time since his death. She stood in the doorway longer than she expected. Dust covered everything. The stool where she once sat was still pushed beneath the bench. For a moment, the grief felt as sharp as it had the winter he died. Then Ellie walked forward. She wiped the dust from the vise, opened the first coffee can, and began looking through what everyone else had forgotten. The barn door failed 3 days later. Ellie's grandfather pulled it shut before supper, and the upper hinge gave a sharp crack. The door dropped several inches. He caught it with his shoulder before it hit the ground. "Perfect," he muttered. The next morning he measured the broken hinge and wrote the replacement cost on a scrap of paper. Ellie saw the number. It wasn't much, but on the Carter farm not much had started to mean something. "I can fix it," she said. Her grandfather looked at her. "With what?" Ellie glanced behind the barn. He followed her eyes. "No, you haven't even seen what I'm going to use. I've seen that pile." He pointed toward the rusted iron. "That's exactly the problem." Ellie waited until he left for the lower field. Then she began searching. She didn't look for another hinge. That was something her father had taught her without Ellie realizing it. If she searched for what an object was, the pile contained almost nothing useful. If she searched for the shape and thickness she needed, everything changed. Near the bottom, she found a flat iron strap from an old wagon. Most of it was badly corroded. One end had nearly rusted through. Ellie almost discarded it. Then she remembered her father's rule: never judge the whole piece by its worst spot. She scraped the middle section with a wire brush. Brown flakes fell away. Underneath was solid metal. Ellie clamped it in her father's vise. For a moment, she simply stood there. Her hand rested on the handle. The last person she had watched turn that vise was her father. Then she tightened it. She worked slowly. She cut away the damaged end, filed the sharp edges, measured the old hinge, measured again. Her first hole was wrong. The drill wandered sideways and left it crooked. Ellie stared at the mistake. Frustration burned behind her eyes. For a moment, she wanted to throw the whole piece aside. Instead, she cut it shorter and started again. By late afternoon, her hands were black with rust and grease. The finished hinge was ugly. One side wasn't perfectly straight. The holes weren't evenly spaced. But when her grandfather returned, Ellie was hanging the barn door. He stopped. "Where did you get that?" Ellie pointed behind the barn. He frowned. "That wagon strap?" "Part of it." They lifted the door together. Ellie fitted the hinge. Her grandfather pushed the door open, then closed it. He opened it again. The hinge held. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, he looked at Ellie. "Don't get carried away. A hinge isn't a plow." "I know. And old iron can fail." "I know." He examined the repair once more. "But this'll hold a door." Ellie smiled. It was the smallest compliment he could have given her. It felt enormous. That evening, she walked behind the barn with a piece of chalk. She drew 3 rectangles on the wooden wall. Above the first, she wrote, "Too far gone." Above the second, "Maybe." Above the third, "Good material." Then she began sorting. That was the moment the pile stopped being a pile. Ellie didn't know it yet, but she had taken the first step toward building something the entire valley would eventually depend on. By the end of the month, Almost everyone in the valley knew about Ellie Carter's scrap pile. Not because they admired it, because Ellie had become a story people enjoyed telling. At Dawson's feed store, someone claimed she had rebuilt half the Carter barn from rusty junk. By the time the story reached Farmer Briggs, Ellie was supposedly collecting enough iron to build an entire tractor. Briggs decided to contribute. The following Saturday, his truck appeared again. 2 broken chains, 3 horseshoes, a cracked cultivator bracket, part of an old wagon wheel. He dumped everything behind the barn. "Building that tractor yet?" "Not yet," Ellie replied. The men laughed. Ellie tried to keep working. She had grown better at pretending the laughter didn't bother her. That wasn't the same as not hearing it. A week later, another farmer arrived. Then another. Soon the Carter barn became the place where useless things went before anyone finally bothered taking them to scrap. Bent gate straps, worn plow parts, buckets of bolts, broken latches, lengths of chain, old wagon hardware. Her grandfather watched the pile expand until one afternoon he finally snapped. "They're using us as a dump." Ellie stopped cleaning a piece of flat stock. He pointed toward the road. "They aren't bringing this because they believe in what you're doing." "I know." "They're laughing at you." Ellie's wire brush stopped moving. "I know that too." Her grandfather's expression softened. That was the answer he hadn't wanted to hear. Ellie looked toward the mountain of rust. "Let them." Then she carried another piece beneath the lean-to. Something had changed. She no longer sorted objects by what they used to be. A broken wagon wasn't a wagon anymore. A damaged cultivator wasn't a cultivator. Once the unusable portions were removed, what remained might be flat iron, heavy plate, round stock, chain, bolts, springs, hardware. She painted labels onto old boards. Light stock, heavy stock, chain, hardware, maybe, reject. The next time Briggs walked behind the barn, he stopped. The mountain was disappearing. In its place stood shelves, hooks, buckets, and neat stacks arranged by thickness and shape. Briggs picked up an old horseshoe. "Planning to sell these back to us?" "Maybe." He laughed. "I'll try to remember which ones were mine." Ellie took the horseshoe gently from his hand. Then she picked up the cracked cultivator bracket he had dumped weeks earlier. "You see a broken bracket? Because that's what it is." Ellie pointed to the cracked end. "This part is." Then she moved her finger several inches down. "But this part may still be material." Briggs gave her the patient smile. Adults sometimes gave children when they believed the conversation had already gone on too long. "Ellie, junk is junk." He walked away. Ellie watched him go. Months earlier, those words might have sent her back into the barn angry. This time they didn't. She looked at the organized shelves. For the first time, Ellie understood that she didn't need Briggs to believe her. She only needed to be right when somebody finally needed what was sitting there. Behind the Carter barn, their joke was becoming an inventory. Ellie's first real mistake happened in the lower field, and it nearly ended everything. Her grandfather had been preparing the ground when a support bracket on the old cultivator cracked. It wasn't a large piece, but without it, one section of the implement dragged crooked through the soil. Her grandfather climbed down from the tractor and examined the brake. "We'll order one." Ellie crouched beside him. "I can make it." He looked at her for a long moment. "This isn't a barn hinge." "I know." "This carries weight." "I know." Her grandfather hesitated. Then he pointed toward the barn. "Show me first." Ellie spent the afternoon searching her organized stacks. Eventually, she found a flat piece from an old wagon assembly. It was almost the right width, almost the right thickness. She cleaned it until dark metal appeared beneath the rust. It looked solid. That was enough for Ellie. Or so she thought. She cut it, drilled it, shaped it against the vise. By evening, she had made something that looked remarkably similar to the broken bracket. Her grandfather inspected it. "You sure?" Ellie nodded. She wanted him to trust her. More than that, she wanted to prove that every hour she had spent sorting rust behind the barn meant something. The next morning, they installed it. For the first 100 yards, it worked. Ellie walked behind the cultivator, watching the repaired section cut through the earth. She felt something rising inside her. Pride. Maybe Briggs had been wrong. Maybe everyone had been wrong. Then she heard it. Snap. The cultivator lurched. Her grandfather stopped immediately. The new bracket had broken clean through. Ellie's stomach dropped. She picked up the two pieces. The metal had looked strong from the outside, but along the fracture, she could see something she had missed, deep corrosion and thinning hidden beneath the rough surface. Her grandfather said nothing until they returned to the barn. Then he placed the broken piece on her father's workbench. Old iron isn't good iron just because you need it. Ellie stared at the floor. The words hurt because she knew he was right. For weeks, she had been proving that everyone else threw things away too quickly. Now, she understood the opposite danger. She could become so determined to find value that she stopped seeing weakness. That evening, Ellie walked through every section behind the barn. She moved pieces from good material back into maybe. Some went directly into too far gone. She began marking deep pits, looking for cracks, comparing thickness, rejecting pieces she would have saved the week before. For the first time, throwing metal away didn't feel like failure. It felt like learning. 2 days later, Ellie carried the broken bracket several miles down the road to the workshop of Samuel Reed, an old blacksmith who had known her father. Samuel examined the fracture without speaking. Then he looked at Ellie. "You made this?" She nodded. "And it broke?" Another nod. Samuel placed the pieces on his bench. "Good." Ellie frowned. "There isn't anything good about it." "There is if you understand why it broke." He pushed a stool toward her. "Sit down." Then he placed 3 rusted pieces of iron on the bench. "They all look old," he said, "but that doesn't mean they're all the same." And for the first time since her father died, Ellie was about to learn from someone who understood exactly what she had been trying to see. Samuel Reed's workshop smelled of coal, oil, and old wood. Ellie sat silently while the blacksmith placed 3 rusted pieces of iron in front of her. To Ellie, they looked almost identical, old, brown, worthless to most people. Samuel pointed to the first. "Would you use that?" Ellie picked it up. She scraped the surface with her thumb. "Maybe." "For what?" She hesitated. "A bracket?" Samuel shook his head. "That's not the first question." He pointed toward the second piece. "What about this one? It looks better." "Still not the first question." Ellie frowned. Samuel leaned against the workbench. "Your father had a habit that used to drive me crazy. He'd bring me something broken and ask if I could save it." Ellie smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." But Thomas understood something important. Samuel picked up the first piece. He didn't ask whether old iron was good. He tapped it against the bench. He asked whether a particular piece was good enough for a particular job. Samuel took a piece of chalk and wrote 3 questions on the wooden wall. Where is it still sound? What load will it carry? What simpler job can it safely do? Ellie read them twice. Samuel picked up the failed cultivator bracket she had made. You answered none of these. Ellie's face reddened. You saw metal that looked thick enough, and you wanted it to work. He pointed toward the fracture. But wanting doesn't make metal stronger. Samuel wasn't cruel about it. That made the lesson hurt more. For the rest of the afternoon, he showed Ellie how differently old pieces could fail. Some were deeply pitted. Some had cracks near holes or bends. Some had become too thin to trust. And sometimes only a small portion of a larger object remained worth keeping. He handed Ellie an old plow component. What is this? A broken plow part. No. Ellie looked at him. Samuel pointed toward the worn end. That's what it was. Then he pointed toward the thicker section farther back. Tell me what you actually have. Ellie examined it carefully. A piece of thick steel. Samuel nodded. Now you're looking. They cut away the damaged portion. Samuel set the remaining section beside several other salvaged pieces. Suddenly, Ellie understood why her father's shelves had always looked so strange. He hadn't been collecting broken objects. He had been collecting possibilities. Before Ellie left, Samuel stopped her at the doorway. One more thing. She turned. Don't try to prove Briggs wrong. Ellie said nothing. That's how you'll make another bad decision. If a piece belongs in the scrap pile, put it there. He pointed toward the 3 questions on the wall. Let the material tell you what it can do. That evening, Ellie returned to the Carter barn. She removed several of her old labels. In their place, she made new ones. Light duty, heavy stock, chain and links, bolts and hardware, repairable. Reject. Then, beneath them all, she painted 3 smaller words. Check before use. The farmers still saw a little girl organizing their garbage, but Ellie had stopped trying to save everything. She was learning something far more valuable. She was learning what not to save. And soon, that difference would matter to a farmer whose entire season was about to depend on one broken piece of metal. The first farmer to come asking for help was not Briggs. It was Henry Dawson. He arrived at the Carter farm just before noon, driving so fast that dust followed his truck all the way to the barn. In the truck bed lay a broken cultivator component. Dawson climbed out carrying 2 pieces of metal. "Your grandfather here?" Ellie pointed toward the north field. Dawson cursed under his breath and placed the broken pieces on the workbench. "What happened?" Ellie asked. "Bracket snapped this morning. Can you get another one?" "Ordered it." "When does it arrive?" Dawson gave a bitter laugh. "They said maybe 10 days. Ellie looked toward his fields across the valley. 10 days mattered. The weather had finally given them a narrow window to work the soil. If rain returned before Dawson finished, parts of his acreage could sit untouched. For a farmer, 10 days could separate a normal season from a bad one. Dawson noticed Ellie examining the bracket. "Don't get any ideas." She looked up. "I wasn't." "You were." Ellie smiled slightly. Then she remembered Samuel's warning. "Don't try to prove anyone wrong." She picked up the broken part. "Can I show this to Mr. Reed?" Dawson hesitated. "You think he can fix it?" "I think he'll know whether we should." That answer surprised him. An hour later, Samuel stood inside the Carter barn examining the fracture. He didn't promise anything. Instead, he asked questions. Where did the bracket sit? What did it support? How had the original failed? Then he looked through Ellie's sorted material. They rejected the first piece. Too thin. The second had deep corrosion near one edge. Rejected. Then Ellie remembered something. Months earlier, Dawson himself had dumped part of an old wagon frame behind the barn. She found it beneath the heavy stock rack. Samuel cleaned a section and examined it carefully. This part might give us what we need. They measured the original bracket, then measured again. Samuel handled the cutting and heating that Ellie wasn't ready to do safely herself. Ellie marked the holes, filed the edges, and checked the dimensions. By late afternoon, a plain replacement sat on the bench. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't factory-made, and Samuel made one thing clear. This is a practical repair, not a promise that scrap can replace every engineered part. We watch it. We inspect it. If it moves, cracks, or bends, you stop. Dawson nodded. They installed it. Then came the test. The cultivator moved 20 yards, 50, 100. Ellie walked beside the field, watching the repaired section. Every bump made her stomach tighten. She remembered the sound of her own bracket snapping. She remembered carrying the 2 broken halves back to the barn, but the new bracket stayed in place. Dawson reached the end of the row, turned, and came back. Still holding, he stopped beside Ellie. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his eyes moved past her toward the organized racks behind the barn. "Where'd that metal come from?" Ellie pointed toward the wagon frame. Dawson stared. "You're kidding." "No. I threw that thing away." Ellie shook her head. "You threw the wagon away." She looked toward the repaired cultivator. "Not all the metal in it." Dawson looked again at the rows of rusted iron. For the first time, Ellie saw his expression change. He wasn't looking at a junk pile anymore, and within weeks, neither would anyone else. 3 weeks after Dawson's cultivator returned to the field, the valley began changing. At first, nobody called it a shortage. Farmer Collins went into town looking for 2 heavy gate hinges. The store had one. Mrs. Harper needed replacement chain links. Back-ordered. Briggs needed a bracket for his hay equipment. "Try again next week," the clerk told him. Next week became 2, then 3. One missing piece didn't sound serious. Until it was your piece. A machine worth hundreds of times more could sit silent because of a bracket small enough to hold in one hand. Livestock could push through a gate because one hinge had failed. A wagon loaded and ready for work could remain beside the barn because one connection had broken. And above all of it hung the one thing farmers couldn't reorder: time. The weather had opened a narrow working window across the valley. Everyone knew it might close again without warning. Ellie began noticing trucks slowing near the Carter farm. Drivers looked toward the barn, toward the shelves they had once laughed at. Most kept driving, until Collins didn't. He arrived one morning carrying a broken hinge. There was no smile on his face, no joke. "You got anything like this?" Ellie took the hinge. "I don't know." Collins seemed surprised by the answer. Months ago, Ellie might have wanted to say yes immediately. Now she measured first. She searched the heavy stock rack. Collins followed and stared at the shelves. He had driven past this material dozens of times, but from the road it had looked like rust. Up close it had names, sizes, uses, limits. Ellie selected one piece, inspected the edges, then set it on the workbench. "Samuel needs to see it." Collins frowned. "You can't just make one?" "Maybe." Ellie looked at him. "But maybe isn't good enough if the gate depends on it." That afternoon, Samuel inspected the material and helped make a simple replacement suitable for the job. The next morning, another farmer came, then two more. A latch, a hook, a damaged bracket. Ellie opened an old ledger. Name, part, size, material, needed. Safe to repair? Possible source. Her grandfather watched her writing. "You know what's happening? They need repairs." "No." He nodded toward the road. Another truck was turning into the yard. "They need what you've been saving." Ellie looked around the barn. Then the thought finally clicked. The valley wasn't short of metal. Metal was everywhere, behind barns, under benches, inside abandoned equipment. What the farmers lacked was the right piece, in the right condition, at the exact moment they needed it. Ellie hadn't built a junk pile. She had built time waiting on shelves. By Friday, 4 trucks stood outside the barn. By Saturday, there were 7. Then another truck appeared. Ellie recognized it immediately. Briggs climbed out. He carried a broken machinery component in both hands. This time, he didn't grin. He didn't say treasure. He placed the piece carefully on Ellie's workbench, then looked at the girl he had spent months laughing at. "Tell me you've got something." Ellie's eyes moved from the broken part to the racks behind him. She knew that shape, and suddenly she remembered exactly who had thrown away the metal she might need to replace it. Ellie remembered exactly where she had seen it. She walked past Briggs without saying a word and disappeared behind the barn. He followed. Ellie stopped beside the rack marked heavy stock and pulled out a long, rust-darkened strip of metal. Briggs stared at it. Then his expression changed. "Wait." Ellie laid it across 2 wooden blocks. Briggs stepped closer. "I know that piece." Ellie looked at him. "You should." Months earlier, Briggs had dumped the remains of an old wagon behind the Carter barn. Most of it had been too damaged to save, but Ellie had cut away several sections that still appeared useful and placed them in storage. Briggs ran his hand across the metal. "That came off my wagon." "Part of it did." He looked toward the broken component he had brought, then back at the strip. For once, Briggs had no joke. Samuel arrived that afternoon. He examined Briggs's broken part, then the salvaged metal. Measurements were taken. The material was checked. One section was rejected because corrosion ran too deep along an edge. But farther down, Samuel found enough sound material for the simple repair they needed. As Samuel worked, Briggs stood beside Ellie's shelves. He began reading the labels. Flat stock, chain and links, bolts and hardware, light duty, repairable, reject. "This all came from us?" he asked. "Most of it." Briggs looked uncomfortable. "You kept track?" "Some of it." Ellie opened her ledger. Each page contained names, measurements, sketches, and notes. What had begun as 3 chalk rectangles on a barn wall had become something far more organized. That evening, Briggs left with his repaired equipment. The next morning, 5 farmers were waiting outside the barn before Ellie finished feeding the chickens. By noon, there were 9. One brought a gate latch. Another carried a broken chain. A third needed a simple bracket. Not every request could be solved. Ellie refused several immediately. "That piece is too far gone. This one needs a proper replacement." "I wouldn't trust salvaged material there." Some farmers complained. But Samuel supported her every time. A repair yard that tried to save everything wouldn't last. The refusals became as important as the repairs. Ellie added another column to her ledger. Replace, do not repair. Her grandfather found an old table and placed it near the entrance. Farmers began leaving broken pieces there with their names written on scraps of paper. Soon, Ellie developed a routine. Measure the broken part. Determine what job it performed. Search the inventory. Reject unsuitable material. Ask Samuel when the work exceeded what she could safely judge or do. Then repair only what made sense to repair. The strangest change happened outside the barn. Farmers stopped arriving with random piles and saying, "Got some junk for you." Instead, they began asking, "Can you use this?" Some even waited before throwing broken equipment away. By the end of the week, the line of trucks stretched from the barn almost to the dirt road. Ellie stood in the doorway looking at them. Months earlier, those trucks had arrived to dump things nobody wanted. Now they were coming because everyone wanted something. Her grandfather stepped beside her. "Quite a junkyard you've got." Ellie smiled. "No." She looked back at the shelves. For the first time, she knew exactly what to call it. It's a repair yard. And before the season ended, those words would be painted above the barn doors. Farmer Briggs returned 3 days later. This time, he wasn't asking Ellie to repair anything. His truck bed was filled with old equipment. Ellie stepped outside. "You dumping more treasure?" Briggs stopped. For a second, neither of them said anything. He remembered. So did she. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Something like that." But Briggs didn't raise the truck bed. He lowered the tailgate and unloaded everything by hand. A chain, 2 heavy iron straps, an old gate assembly, several pieces from machinery that hadn't worked in years. He placed each item beside Ellie's sorting table instead of throwing it onto the ground. "Thought you might want to look through them?" Ellie studied him. "Before what?" "Before I decide they're useless." That answer mattered more than Briggs probably realized. By afternoon, other farmers followed. Dawson brought bolts. Collins brought wagon hardware. Mrs. Harper arrived with old pieces stored beneath a shed for years. Ellie examined everything. Some went into inventory. Some went into reject. And this time, nobody complained when she said no. They had finally learned that refusing bad material wasn't wasting something. It was protecting whoever might trust it later. Then Briggs noticed a heavy hook hanging beside the workbench. "Where'd that come from?" "Your old harrow." His eyes narrowed. "The one I dumped?" "Part of it." Nearby sat a gate latch. "Dawson's wagon," Ellie explained. On another shelf was flat stock cut from Briggs's wagon frame. He stared around the barn. For months, he had imagined Ellie collecting broken things. Now there were almost no broken things left. There was no wagon, no harrow, no old gate. There were only materials separated by condition, thickness, size, and possible use. Briggs touched one of the shelves. "You know what's strange?" Ellie kept measuring. "What?" "We already had all of this." She looked up. Briggs glanced toward the yard. "We kept complaining that we couldn't get what we needed." He lifted a salvaged hook. "And half the material was sitting behind our own barns." Ellie shook her head. "Having metal isn't enough." Briggs looked toward her ledger. "No." Then he gave a small, embarrassed smile. "Having a pile isn't the same as knowing what you've got." That evening, Briggs stayed. He helped Ellie's grandfather carry another shelving unit inside. Dawson helped move the sorting table. Collins brought more coffee cans for bolts. No one announced that they were helping Ellie build anything. They simply started doing it. Near sunset, Briggs picked up one last rusted piece from beside his truck. Months earlier, he would have thrown it toward the pile without looking. Instead, he carried it to Ellie. "Where do you want the material?" Ellie pointed toward the inspection table. "Right there." He set it down carefully. Ellie watched him walk back to the truck. The word sounded small. Material. But she understood what it meant. The joke was over. By late summer, a new wooden sign hung beneath the Carter name above the barn. Carter Repair Yard. Ellie had painted it herself. The letters weren't straight. Neither was the board. Nobody laughed. Every morning, farmers arrived carrying things that once would have been left behind sheds: broken chains, bent brackets, old hinges, wagon hardware, lengths of iron, But nothing was dumped anymore. Everything stopped first at Ellie's sorting table. Some pieces were cleaned, some were saved for light-duty use. Some gave up only bolts or hardware. Others received a red mark. Do not use. Ellie had once hated the reject pile. Now she was almost proud of it. Samuel had taught her that knowing what not to trust was as important as recognizing something useful. Around her, the repair yard continued growing. Her grandfather built shelves. Samuel organized tools. Dawson donated an old cabinet. Briggs brought lumber. Collins arrived with coffee cans for bolts and washers. The same farmers who had once built Ellie's junk pile piece by piece were now helping build its replacement. One afternoon, Ellie's grandfather stood in the doorway watching her inspect a broken gate assembly. 2 bolts were still good. The hinge wasn't. Ellie marked it red. Then she found a sound piece of flat stock that Samuel could inspect for a replacement. Her grandfather smiled. "You know, I was wrong." Ellie looked up. "About what?" "That pile." She wiped her hands. "You hated that pile." "I did." He stared toward the shelves. "I thought you were collecting old iron." "I was." Her grandfather shook his head. "No." Then he said something that made Ellie stop moving. "You were collecting time." She frowned. He pointed toward the farmers waiting outside. "A hinge that saves someone 40 miles into town." He pointed toward another bench. "A bracket that keeps a machine running until the proper replacement arrives." Then toward the chains hanging from hooks. "A piece that keeps a gate working today instead of next week." He looked back at Ellie. "That's what they're coming here for." Ellie looked toward her father's workbench. For years, she had thought his habit of keeping bolts, brackets, straps, and scraps had been about money. Maybe part of it was. But now she understood something else. Farmers didn't always need miracles. Sometimes they needed one ordinary thing before sunset. The Carter repair yard couldn't replace manufactured parts. It couldn't make every repair safe. And Ellie had learned never to pretend otherwise. What it could do was give sound material one more chance before a farmer lost days waiting for something that might already exist nearby. That evening, Ellie opened her ledger. On one of the earliest pages, she found the uncertain words she had written months before. Good material, maybe. She remembered the 12-year-old girl who had written them, the girl trying desperately to prove that something her father believed was still true. Ellie smiled. Then, she turned to a fresh page. Available, needed, matched. Outside, another truck approached. Not to dump anything, not to laugh. Someone needed something, and now there was a place where they knew to look. The last truck arrived on a cold morning near the end of harvest. Ellie knew the engine before she saw it. Briggs. His truck rolled slowly into the yard. The bed was full. Chains. A bent wagon rim. Iron straps. A box of bolts. 2 broken hinges. An old plow component covered in orange rust. It looked almost exactly like the first load he had dumped behind the barn months earlier, except nobody was sitting in the truck bed laughing. Briggs parked beside the sorting table. Ellie folded her arms. More treasure? He smiled. Careful. That joke belongs to me. Her grandfather laughed from the doorway. Briggs lowered the tailgate. Got some scrap. His hand reached toward the first piece, then stopped. He glanced at Ellie. No. She waited. Briggs corrected himself. Got some material. For a moment, the yard went quiet. Ellie smiled. Not because Briggs had admitted she was right. Somehow that didn't matter nearly as much anymore. She lifted the plow component. One end was badly worn. Deep corrosion had eaten into the edge. Ellie marked it with chalk. Probably lose this section. Briggs nodded. She turned the piece over. Farther back, the metal thickened. Samuel can inspect the rest. Months earlier, Briggs would have laughed. Now he simply carried it to the inspection table. They unloaded the truck together. Some pieces went directly into reject, others into maybe. A few earned places on the organized shelves. Nothing became valuable merely because it was old. Nothing became worthless merely because it was ugly. By afternoon, the last farmer had collected his repaired gate hardware. Samuel extinguished the forge. Ellie's grandfather closed the ledger. The valley settled into silence. Ellie walked behind the barn alone. She remembered the first morning. The crashing metal, the laughter, her grandfather's anger, the mountain of objects nobody wanted. Now there were shelves, labels, measurements, buckets of hardware, stock, waiting for the right job. And beside everything stood the reject pile, proving that she had finally learned the part of her father's lesson he had never lived long enough to teach her. Saving something didn't mean pretending it wasn't broken. Ellie noticed one of Briggs's first rusted horseshoes. It had never become anything. Maybe it never would. She carried it inside and hung it on a nail beside her father's old workbench. Not because the horseshoe was useful, because she was. Because everything she had learned had begun here. Her father had taught her to ask what good material could still do. Samuel had taught her to respect what damaged material could no longer do. And the farmers had taught her something none of them intended. Value could disappear long before the material itself disappeared. Sometimes all it took was for people to stop looking. Outside, Briggs started his truck. "Ellie," she turned. "I've got another old wagon behind my north shed." Ellie waited. Briggs smiled. "If you ever need material, you can look through it." Ellie's smile widened. "I will." Briggs drove away. He hadn't called the wagon junk. He hadn't told her to haul it away. He understood now. Ellie had never learned how to turn garbage into gold. She had learned something less glamorous and far more important, how to recognize what was still worth keeping. And on a farm where one broken part could cost an entire week, sometimes that was enough to keep a family moving for one more season.